Thank you, Maya, so much for coming on today because I'm so excited to read your amazing books. I'm doing a quick introduction and then we'll go straight into it, which is in her debut collection of poetry, writer Maya Kalaria maps her journey into the mysterious underworld of grief and the extraordinary lessons she learned in the darkness in Half Woman, Half Grief. Maya is a woman of color, a poet, and has helped to support people's well-being as an engagement worker and hypnotherapist. She's also spoken on the radio about grief, identity, and bullying. She's also the co-host of the Decolonial Podcast. So, first of all, I have to ask, it's such a beautiful, beautiful poetry book, which is, what made you decide to write this now in your life? And like, how do you define half woman, half grief?
Oh, thank you for asking me that question. So my mum died when I was 9, and I was a very, very young girl. The older I get, the more I realize how young I actually was at the time. And my grief was never supported or processed by my family. And so I held the grief in me for a really long time, and it kind of transmuted into a like CPTSD as well. So like complex trauma. I had some family issues as well, such as narcissistic abuse and like emotional neglect and things like that. So it turned into this very messy conglomeration of trauma inside me that I lived with every day and thought was normal. But actually eventually realized this isn't actually normal. This isn't healthy. I have suffered immensely, and most people haven't gone through this in their life. So that's one part of it. The second part is I've always been a poet. So even when my mum was alive, I wrote poetry. So she used to send my work to publishers, even at the age of 7 or 8. So she was always incredibly supportive, and I always knew that I wanted to publish a book. So when I went to university, I studied English and creative writing. And for a while after university, because it killed my creative spirit, I'm not going to lie, I didn't actually write for a really long time. And then around 7 years later, I picked up the pen again. And these poems, so I never actually wrote the poems for a book. I wrote the poems because they came through me as sort of intuitive downloads. So some of them came through in the middle of the night where I had to write them down. Some of them came through when I was in Mother Nature, like in a forest near a river, when I had some sort of divine inspiration. Other times it just came through when I was like just doing daily tasks, and I quickly had to write these downloads down. So the poems came first, and I never ever sit down as a poet and intend to write a poem. I just write it when it comes to me. I let it come to me. I don't ever force anything. So I haven't actually written for a couple of years now. So that's how it is. Like I kind of just expect that it comes and it goes sometimes. So I had all these poems. I realized that I had enough to write a book. I used to work in mental health with young people, and I remember talking to a young person at the time who was an illustrator. And they said to me, you know what, we should do what we always wanted to do. Why don't we just start with the first easiest step? And I said, okay, well, the first easiest step for me to publish a book is to pick the poems that I want to publish. So I went home and I picked a few poems, and I realized that all of the poems were about grief, and that there was a theme here, and that it made complete sense that because I wasn't supported by people around me to process my grief, I found a way through writing to process it, and through poetry. And there was like a guiding force that was bigger than me that was coming through and helping me. So I thought, okay, the book's going to be about grief. And I have a partner who I'm still with now, and he was incredibly supportive. So it really helped that I did have someone that believed in me. If I hadn't have had someone who believed in me, I don't think I could have done it, because it was such a difficult process. So that's essentially how it came about. It was the right time. I was in the right place. I finally had support, and I had a bunch of poems. And I was lucky enough to be connected to a few creatives in the Bristol area. So I found an illustrator who was happy to illustrate some beautiful beautiful pictures for the book. And I also had a book designer who was happy to help as well. So it was just like serendipitous, really. And I can't remember the next question you asked me. It was like two questions. So one is, how did the book come about? And then, what is the essence of
Yeah. So how
grief?
do you define, half woman, half grief?
So I would define half woman, half grief as a mystical journey through the underworld. It came from divine inspiration. So I don't believe it all came from me. I was a vessel for it, but it's deeper than me. And I believe there is certain, there's like an energy to it that carries the reader through the book if the reader is open to that. I would describe it as a journey into the underworld, a journey into darkness, learning how to embrace our own darkness and our own rage and our own shame and the difficulties in life. So I would say it's a guidebook for going through your own underworld. Whether you've lost a human in real life or whether you are grieving for who you used to be, or you're having environmental grief or colonial grief or any sort of grief, grief about how the world has changed with COVID, and any of that is relevant to reading the book as well.
That's fascinating. And I find it really interesting that you found poetry as like a way to sort of process or go into when you didn't really have that level of support. And so I wanted to actually ask, like, did you have any level of support after your mother passed away?
No. So my dad remarried. So he actually got with a school friend's mum within 8 weeks of my mum dying. Yeah, so she died on the 5th of December 96. And by Valentine's Day, February, he was already with this other woman. She's a white English woman, and her dad served in the British Army in India. So, and she's very proud of him, and doesn't admit that there was any wrongdoing there. So it's a very complex, painful history. And she was the one who I suffered narcissistic abuse from. So I don't talk to her anymore.
Yeah.
So I didn't have any support. I actually had abuse and neglect. There were times of some love, but it was never support in my grief. I never had anyone sit down and go, like, we really need to talk about this, and maybe you should see a counselor. Maybe you need more help than this. People just expected me to get on with it, and I got praised for getting on with it. Oh, you're doing so well. Just because I wasn't crying. So I just felt so much shame around expressing my pain, and I just hid it away. So no, I didn't. I actually received the opposite. I received abuse, and I don't talk to most of my family now because of how badly they responded during that time. Sadly.
So yeah, I mean, it's so sad to hear that, especially since you were so young as well, which is just so sad. And it was so sweet when you were saying that your mother was kind of like your safe place, isn't it? And
yeah.
Did you manage to find any kind of safety? Like, was there a place where you could kind of run to for safety after you felt that level of loss when you were like 9 years old?
I think my own imagination, my own sort of inner world. And I think things like animals, nature. I had some friendships which were like one particular friendship I had for many, many years. I felt safe with her. So there were a few different things, but I do believe I was guided by a larger force, because I don't actually know how I got through that time without being completely suicidal or like suffering with like severe depression, because I didn't have either of those things, and I don't know how, because I was quite alone. Yeah, I'm surprised.
Yeah, it is. It's so tough to, especially when you have PTSD, to not have that level of depression. And like, gosh, it's so hard. And there was a specific line which I thought was really interesting, which you said, my brother and I weren't told about the severity of her illness, but my grandparents moved in to look after us. And that's what I was like wondering, do you feel it's like kind of essential that to have those kind of straightforward conversations with children about loss?
I do. it's a funny one, because as much as I do blame them for not talking about it, I also know how emotional and sensitive I am, and how actually it would have ruined my life at the time. So it would have affected my schoolwork. I wouldn't have been able to concentrate, thinking any minute now she could die.
Right.
I think actually it would have been worse if, personally for me. At the same time, I wish someone had even spoken to me about what death was, because I didn't even, like, I kind of understood it from watching TV and films and all that kind of stuff, but like there was no conversation about death or the afterlife or what happens when we die. So it just kind of all happened, and then we all just had to deal with it, and many of us just didn't deal with it. We just sort of, like my dad, he just ignored it, pushed it away, and never mentioned it again, like it's insane really, but that's literally what he did. So yeah.
God, I'm like, I do wonder, like we're in therapy and stuff. I always think about, like, they talk about sort of a child self, and I was just wondering, as an adult, like now, how would you like treat your child self as if she was going through this right now?
I do a lot of inner child work myself, so I go into my own memories and I comfort my child self, because that's part of the inner work. And so it's a very sort of energetic process. It's very sort of healing. So I give her, so I personally, I need a lot of physical affection, physical comfort, and because I'm a highly sensitive person, I needed someone to kind of be sensitive to my needs, which were kind of heightened. So I think I needed things like warmth, like literal warmth, because I feel the elements so harshly, and I can't heal unless I've got like certain conditions in place.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Like comfort and warmth, like being told that I'm not wrong and I haven't done anything wrong, things like that, kind of just the opposite of being shamed, which is what I ended up having. I ended up being shamed, so I would go and reverse that shame and just tell myself how wonderful I am, and how I'm not bad. Bad things are happening to me, but I'm not causing that, because I think I blamed myself for my mum's death, for the abuse that followed, and then I just became enveloped in shame. And I'm still working on that now. Like I can see it coming up in all the time. It's a long process to heal that shame, and then especially colonialism and being, having racism since your first breath. And then kind of the shame of being like women's shame, and then the intersection of like being in Britain and being South Asian, because there's so much shame in South Asian culture. So it's like just shame upon shame upon shame, and then looking different to the people around you. And it was just like a tsunami of shame. Basically.
Totally. And it's so much harder, as you say, as a HSP, like I'm a HSP as well. And so things I totally understand is like I have to have like weighted blankets to just feel that level of like just comfort. And everything has to be perfect as well, as you say. Like otherwise it just wouldn't work, like sleep or anything. So I totally understand. And I guess it makes it even harder, like to go through those situations when you are HSP, and it's there's just no understanding of it. And I think there was this obviously like really fits into what we've been saying, which is, I think you mentioned our society doesn't provide the correct tools to support people through grief, and our family did not have the vocabulary nor the emotional capacity to know or give us what we needed. So what do you think needs to change in terms of dealing with grief in the community?
Oh, so much. I think firstly we need to accept that there is grief, because I think people aren't even accepting that. So accepting there is grief, knowing what grief is, because maybe people don't have the right idea of grief. Maybe they think it's just like bawling your eyes out 24/7, and it can be that, but it's not that. I haven't experienced a lifetime of that. I've had moments, but it comes and goes. But grief is more of an energetic feeling in your body than it is necessarily you just crying all the time. I think having more open conversations about death, about death, but also our beliefs around death, because we claim to be so spiritual and religious as a society, but then when it comes to the afterlife, which apparently we're, I know, speaking from someone from a Hindu background, we're supposed to believe in that, and yet like no one talks about it really. No one really knows what's going on. We've lost touch with like what we're supposed to believe, and our spiritual roots and our mysticism roots, because there are so many roots that are buried in mysticism, and also whether you're Hindu, whether you're even in Islam, there's like Sufism, and even Judaism has like mystical roots. Like there's a mystical element to everything. Christianity, it doesn't matter. I think there's mysticism everywhere, but we as South Asians, I think we've had so much trauma. We've been deliberately taken or separated from our roots, our cultural and spiritual roots. And I think then when it comes to death, we don't have the vocabulary because we're too petrified to go into our own grief and our own pain. So we don't even know where to start. But I think, more open conversations like, what is death? What happens when you die? Let's explore this other realm that, many of us are too afraid to experience. But, our intuition, where is that coming from? Like, what happens? Do we experience spiritual beings? And all of that I feel like we need to talk about, basically.
Yeah, and obviously I had to ask, like, because I think there was one poem where you mentioned that, when you were trying to kind of speak to your family, right, but they basically couldn't upset them, and basically you had this level of despair, but you had to kind of bury it inwards. And I was just wondering, did you ever get to have that conversation with them, like with your brother and your father, regarding the trauma?
So yes and no. They do know what went wrong, and my brother has suffered immensely too. So he's been like a victim of this as well. So he's accepted that he didn't get the support and I didn't get the support. My dad only last year sent a text to both of us saying, "Oh, I'm sorry that I didn't support you after your mum died," but that's like 24 years later, and also it can't be just resolved by text. It's not like you're off the hook now. Like, I have CPTSD, I have like all of the stuff now because you literally couldn't either be bothered or just didn't or chose not to address it, so I have been honest and open. I don't think my dad has the capacity, so I've had to accept that he may never, and I'm like, I grieve for that, I still grieve for that, and that's just a kind of ongoing process. Kind of accepting that some people have a lot of trauma and they might not be able to change necessarily in this lifetime. And that's kind of okay as well, because they have their own grief and trauma as well. So it's a hard one.
It is a hard one. And I think for women it can be really, really tough, isn't it? Especially like Indian women, where you're not allowed to express rage. And I just do wonder, like, what do you think is the effect of unexpressed rage?
Oh, a lot. So illnesses for a start. So unexpressed rage turns right into headaches, physical symptoms, illness, all sorts of illness. And then it becomes projected onto others. So I have women in my own family whose unexpressed rage then gets projected onto those who are expressing their rage, because it's kind of a envy, like, well, what gives you the right to express yours? I'm going to shut you down instead of being angry at the people that I'm really angry at, because I will be abandoned and I can't go there, so I'll just do the easy route. So projected onto the wrong people, passive aggressiveness, hatred for oneself, all sorts of stuff. I mean, it's terrible when a woman holds in their rage, especially a South Asian woman. But I understand why they do. But I think it's high time we start expressing it, because that energy gets stuck in you and it just burns you from the inside out. And it's valid. It's a valid rage, like it's coming from somewhere, like, and justice has been done. and you validly feel angry about it and hurt, and it should be expressed somehow.
Completely. Like, it's so strange that we suppress such normal human emotion. It's part of the range of emotion, isn't it? It's just like, you can't have happiness if you don't have sadness, and you can't have, life without death. And it's so
Yeah.
strange. We live in binaries, but we can't seem to accept the harsh side of it, even though it's just reality, isn't it?
Yeah, and I do think that's an element of Christian colonialism where it's like turn the other cheek, so that like higher powers that could have that were benefiting from us acting our lot, if that makes sense. We were kind of conditioned, especially in the Western world, to just like take it. And especially as South Asians who have been colonized, I think we didn't have a choice but to accept the sort of abuse that we had. So I think it's kind of scary to show your rage, because we don't know what's going to happen when we do, like whether there'll be a punishment or whether we'll be abandoned or shamed. So it's not easy necessarily to express it. Yeah.
So where do you keep like the boundless fury of your pain now? And like, why do you think pain is actually really important? It's an important part of like the grieving process.
Okay, so I think so for me, I keep the boundless fury of my grief, and I keep that. It comes up. I'm like a volcano. I do have a lot of rage, so I have learned to channel it healthier now. So when it comes up, I channel it through my activism work, or I do some sort of energetic work within myself, like to heal that part, because underneath rage is usually grief and sorrow, pain, from one thing or another. So I'll try and figure out the root of it. But if it is like completely validated, someone has done something, I do try and direct it towards whatever the cause is, in a healthy way. I think rage doesn't have to be attacking someone. It can be a very clean energy where you state that you've been wronged and why. So I'm doing a workshop on this really soon with my friend Emma, where I'm going to talk about Maya Kalaria and how her energy has infused me with inspiration about how to channel my rage. So I talk more about that on my Instagram page. So that's coming up really soon. But in terms of pain, I think pain is really necessary for living. And I think if we block out pain, we block out our own joy. We can only feel our own joy to the extent that we feel our pain. If you try and block out or numb one emotion, you kind of end up numbing them all. You can't be selective. If you could, we'd all do it. But what happens is like people try and numb out their pain, but they end up numbing out then all of their emotions, like their happiness, their joy, their excitement. So it kind of is a necessary part of life, just like winter is a necessary part of the seasons. Death is as important as life. As you said, we don't know one without the other. And I think that's why the book is about the darkness, because I found light by embracing the darkness. That's the grand irony of the whole thing. I was suffering much more in the darkness when I wasn't embracing where I was, and when I wasn't like learning from it and healthily walking through it. When I was trying to push it away, I plunged even more so into the darkness. It's only when I accepted, like, hey, I'm in this place, I'm grieving, it's okay. That's when I could come out of it and actually feel happy again eventually. It's a weird irony of life.
But, I totally agree with that. Exactly. Because you can't really show anything else if you don't go down those routes, like those sort of that dark path, isn't it? It's so difficult. And actually, I found it really great that you went into therapy and that you found the friends and you found your partner, who obviously is a really good support. And how do you think they helped you to heal? Or maybe heal as much?
It was validation. Like, if I had to say one core thing, it was just that they listened and they said, yeah, like I get why you feel that way. Of course you feel that way. Like, you lost your mum when you were 9. That is absolutely horrific. And then you were abused. I don't even know how you've done it. You know, all of them validated me. And I think because I come from being heavily invalidated by many, many family members, it just was this absolute revelation. And it, like, you know, our nervous system is so wrought when we're in trauma. And it just calmed my nervous system down. It made me feel safe. Like, I'm not making this up. I really went through this. It's been witnessed. It's been validated. And that was a huge part of it. Just to have someone like hold space and in a loving, accepting way, just to validate who I am and what I've been through.
Definitely. And that's thank God, you know, definitely. And actually, yeah, it's so true. Like, I was like, what do you think was the effect of denial on the like on your sort of on your journey?
Devastating, absolutely devastating. Yeah, people's denial of my pain, of who I was, of my sensitivity, of my abuse. I still have denial of my abuse now. Devastating. It made me feel invalid as a person, which I'm still working through now, to validate myself and to allow validation to penetrate my psyche and my emotional body. I was gaslit. And then I ended up blaming myself, thinking I'm wrong. And what happened is I became a hyper perfectionist because who I was never enough. Then everything I did was never enough. And even now I have perfectionist tendencies, which I'm aware of, but it's just that never enoughness, you know, because the love I received was so conditional. And I had to work so hard to get it, and it never really came in the way that I needed it. So hugely devastating, hugely. And for anyone listening, and I know other people will have gone through this 100%, it was devastating, but I do believe and hope that it can be healed, because I've seen deep healing in myself. So I know that this can be healed. It does take time, and it does require patience and compassion towards yourself, but I'm here to say it's definitely doable.
And actually, I wanted to ask, because obviously the chapter names are almost like that sort of journey, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually, so it's like the unraveling, the surrender, the excavation, and the resurrection. So would you call this part of your evolution?
Oh yeah, it's kind of like if anyone's heard of The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, where it's like an initiate has to go through a particular journey, and then they become initiated at the end, but they have to go through this big challenging journey, often into the underworld. So there's a lot of mythology around people going into the underworld, having these like initiations, and then coming out again more integrated. So that's kind of why I called it that, because I realized that my poems perfectly mapped that journey out without me even like realizing. So yeah, like it was an evolution, and I'm not here to say to anyone that grief is ever completely healed, because you know it can't be. I will miss my mum till the day I die. I mean, but I think we as humans want to put things in boxes, and we want to make everything really clean cut, and we can't handle it when it's not. And so the book is kind of saying, even until the end, you know, it's bittersweet. It's there's pain, but there's also love. And that's kind of the message of it. It's like, yes, it's an evolution, but I'm coming out not without grief, embracing my grief, letting it kind of teach me. And I wouldn't be here as a mystic, or, you know, someone that believes in that part of life, if my grief hadn't taught me that there's more to life than what we just physically see.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because, you know, even though death is inevitable, why do you think we grieve?
Because we haven't been, I think it's because of our unhealthy relationship with death as a society. And I'm not just talking about Western society, I'm talking about most societies. I think indigenous cultures like have a much healthier relationship because they live closer to Mother Earth, and Mother Earth is a great teacher. We come from the earth and we literally go back to the earth, and so they work with the rhythms of earth, so death is not quite as shock, whereas we've become so detached from the earth that when someone dies, it's like almost this violent occurrence that feels very wrong. So then we kind of grieve, feeling like everything's wrong, like that someone shouldn't have died, like death is wrong no matter what age. And I think that's the biggest myth, that death is wrong. I think we don't understand the nature of life, and then we don't understand the nature of death. And so that's kind of why it kind of, we will always grieve, in the sense that if someone you love dies, you are going to miss them. But I think there's an added toxicity to the grief that a lot of us have because we don't understand the nature of life and death, and we don't have the support. So our grief is like elongated, made much worse because we're often alone in it. People aren't talking about it. We don't understand what death is. We haven't explored our own beliefs around it. And so it just intensifies like the crapness of grief, Yeah.
Do you think we can ever get stuck in grief?
Yes, because I was. I 100% was. Yep, that happened to me. I was stuck in my own grief. I could not get out of it. I think everyone is stuck in their own grief, and I think that's the cause of the majority of the world's problems, like unhealed grief, unhealed trauma that then gets just projected onto our outside world. So yeah, I could get really meta about this, but I'll just leave it at that. I think a lot of us are stuck in our own grief, and I think that's why a lot of us have dependencies and addictions, whether it's alcohol, drugs, shopping, porn, you name it, gambling. It's a grief that's frozen inside that we don't have access to, or that we can't keep moving outside of ourselves.
And like, how would you say you deal with your own grief now?
So I was dealing with it yesterday. I had grief coming up. For me, I love crying in the shower. I really, really like, because the shower, as a HSP, for me, the shower is like one of my favorite parts of the day because it's so comforting. I feel like I'm getting like a hug because like I love hot water. It just makes me feel very like warm and safe. And the water like hitting me and my body, like it helped. I think being in that element, it helps me to cry. So I'm like feeling low at the moment because a lot of things are coming up for me. I embrace it. I accept that I'm going through it. I accept that it will end at some point and I can't force it. And when the tears come, I just let them flow. I think we all have to find our own way to grieve because for me, it's like I have to be alone. Some people might want to go to others. Some people might want to go to nature or watch a film that can help them cry, or or write it down. I used to write in my diary for years, like all of my emotions. So there's many different ways, but that's how I deal with mine at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think I think that's helpful though, actually, because those tips are helpful for anyone else who's listening, because sometimes it's really hard to, instead of, a lot of people just avoid it, isn't it? So sometimes you just need to sort of go through it.
Yeah, and I would say as well, we live in our heads a lot of the time. So what to really grieve, we need to come back down to the body and to feel what the body is feeling. So for me, I often I'll do some like stretches or some like breath work, and that's when the tears will come. So I think we need to get back into our bodies a bit more so that we can like really feel the pain that we're in. And I think a lot of us don't want to feel the pain that we're in. That's why we go back into our heads. That's why we live in this like virtual world, or we try and escape. And I think it's about coming back to our physical bodies, because that's where the trauma is held, like literally in our bodies. So that's how I find the tears flow, like when I really start breathing deeply and stretching and feeling into like my different limbs. It'll often open something up for me.
And so would you say anything to our listeners here, what like as you're working through it, is like what would you say to them in terms of their grief?
I would say to be a human on this planet right now, is to grieve. And I would say you are healthy. There is nothing wrong with you. Your grief will come and go. So you're not necessarily going to stay like this forever. It's a transient thing. If you accept it, it's more likely to go quicker. And it will come back around, because our life is difficult being on this planet. There's always something that could trigger grief. But the more you accept it and embrace it, the more it becomes a muscle. The more you get like a muscle memory around it, and you're like, okay, that's okay. I'm grieving a bit. I accept that. I embrace that. I'm going to allow myself some grace during this time. And I know it's gonna leave, because every other time it has as well. I'm going to find a safe place to cry. I'm going to write about it. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to listen to my favorite music, whatever I need to do. And eventually it will go, and I'll be okay again. And then next time it comes, I'll just do the same thing. So I think it's like releasing the terror we have around it, that once we feel it, we'll never be able to unfeel it, and it will be stuck in this like absolute horror show. But it's like, no, if you cry, you often feel better afterwards. Like a lot of us experience that. So it's literally about releasing it.
Yeah, totally. Maya, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Amazing book. Really recommend everyone going out and buying it. And it's just, it's such a important subject, especially everyone is grieving now through this pandemic. And we shouldn't really avoid such emotion either. So thank you, Maya, for bringing this topic up as well to our attention.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and you're welcome. I do get a lot of joy from talking about this, which sounds weird, but I know that it can provide some help for someone out there. So thank you.